Senator from Utah.
Madam President, as we speak, our fellow citizens in Puerto Rico, Texas, and Florida are recovering from a series of devastating hurricanes. Over 100 people have lost their lives because of these terrible storms. Many more are struggling to get by day to day. The crisis is perhaps most acute in Puerto Rico, where 35% of the population still does not have access to safe drinking water. 4 out of 5 Puerto Ricans do not have power. The people of Florida, Puerto Rico, and Texas have responded with great tenacity and admirable creativity to this disaster. I wish the same could be said of the politicians here in Washington, D.C. Once again, this body is poised to fail the American people. Instead of helping the victims of these disasters through responsible aid paired with lasting reform, Congress has rushed to its favorite so-called solution: billions of dollars in new spending with little accountability or meaningful oversight. If this $36.5 billion aid package passes, it'll mean more money and more power for government programs that, in some cases, left us vulnerable to these disasters in the first place. If it passes, the politicians and lobbyists will pat themselves on the back for doing a good deed, and then move on to the next multi-billion-dollar spending opportunity. Meanwhile, the people of Florida, Puerto Rico, and Texas will be left to pick up the pieces and to deal with the disastrous consequences of this approach. Puerto Rico, in particular, has to contend with the effects of a devastating storm and of decades of malfeasance that have left Puerto Rico in $74 billion of debt. This crisis calls for emergency aid, yes, but more than that, it calls for true, lasting reform, the type of reform that's noticeably absent from this measure. That's why I'm voting no on this short-sighted bill, because it's easy to caricature a vote against emergency aid as calloused or cruel, but it's hard to do the real work that is necessarily required by real, lasting, meaningful reform. And it's harder still to defend these packages when their contents are exposed fully to the light of day. If you were evaluating an emergency aid package, you might reasonably expect it to direct all of its spending to programs that actually help the people of Florida, of Puerto Rico, of Texas. But this proposal does not direct all of its money to broad-based recovery efforts. Not even close. Just under half of the $36.5 billion in new spending would bail out the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. In the Houston area, just 17% of homeowners were enrolled in NFIP. In Puerto Rico, the numbers were even more sparse. Just 5,600 Puerto Ricans are enrolled in NFIP, less than 1% of homeowners. That means 99% of Puerto Ricans won't get anything at all from the $16 billion to NFIP. But then again, it's not clear that NFIP recipients get much from NFIP to begin with. The National Flood Insurance Program represents the triumph of good intentions over sound public policy. Its generous subsidies were supposed to reduce the need for federal aid after massive storms. Instead, NFIP encourages thousands of Americans to live in some of the most dangerous real estate in the country. NFIP sells flood insurance at rates well below that of any reasonable private insurer. As a result, its policies do not accurately reflect the risk of living in manifestly flood-threatened, flood-endangered areas. These government policies encourage Americans to live in precisely those areas where their livelihoods, and in fact, even their lives, can be swept away in an instant. Economists refer to this perverse incentive as moral hazard. And in more senses than one, that's just what the National Flood Insurance Program is, a hazard to America. It is distinctly immoral for the government to subsidize housing in the nation's floodplains, deep within those floodplains, or on the edges of its coasts. Instead of building your house on a rock, the government wants you to build it on the sand. And NFIP pays out claims for properties that have been swept away, not once, not twice, but many, many times before. Homes that have been flooded multiple times make up just 1% of NFIP policyholders, but they account for more than 1/3 of its claims. This has cost taxpayers more than $12.1 billion in payouts, according to the Congressional Research Service. When Hurricane Harvey swept through Houston last month, it submerged a house that had been flooded 22 times since 1979. The house is valued at about $600,000. The government has spent $1.8 million to rehabilitate it. No private insurance company would ever offer insurance on the terms that NFIP offers. Such a company would endanger its policyholders, and it would run out of money. And that is precisely what has happened under NFIP. The program is $25 billion in debt and routinely blows through its statutory debt limits. The emergency aid package Congress is considering today would cancel $16 billion of NFIP's debt. No questions asked. Congress isn't making NFIP bring its actuarial practices in line with reality or into conformity with free market forces. No, it isn't even appropriating new funds for another failed program. That at least would be business as usual in Washington. Instead, Congress effectively is giving a debt amnesty to the National Flood Insurance Program. It is absolving NFIP in its sins and making American taxpayers do the penance. So that's an example of what's in the bill. Let's consider a little bit of what's not in the bill. If we want to be responsible leaders in a moment of crisis like this one, we need to provide long-term reforms in addition to any short-term assistance. We need to provide a full meal to those affected by these storms and not just a temporary passing sugar rush. But this bill does not include any reforms that would help Puerto Rico attain long-term stability or climb out from underneath its $74 billion debt. It doesn't even attempt to reform the dysfunctional electric utility program, which through a combination of neglect and profiteering has left millions of Puerto Ricans in darkness. Without electricity, Puerto Rico can't power hospitals, food banks, or even sewage systems. And it doesn't repeal the Jones Act, the protectionist regulation that kept foreign flagged relief ships out of Puerto Rican harbors for precious days after Hurricane Maria, and for a long time have forced Puerto Rican consumers to pay significantly higher prices on just about everything they buy. Simple reform measures, such as reforming PREPA, the electric utility company I mentioned a moment ago, or repealing the Jones Act, would provide very meaningful, lasting benefits to Puerto Ricans long after the public's attention has drifted and the relief money has dried up. But Congress, true to form, would rather double down on broken laws and broken programs rather than fix them. And Congress would rather take on more debt rather than spend according to what we have and prioritize in order to get there. None of this $36.5 billion in emergency spending is offset by spending reductions to other programs. None of it, not a single dollar. And that's the sad irony of this bill. If the trend of deficit-fueled spending continues, one day soon, we'll wake up to the cries of our fellow Americans, and we'll have nothing to give them in support. But again, this bill doesn't take care of those programs, and it's not as if there aren't solutions out there. One of my colleagues, Senator Paul, has effectively been blocked from introducing an amendment that would call for offsets to this spending. And another one of my colleagues, Senator Flake, has tried to introduce an amendment, of which I'm a co-sponsor, that would bring about some of these other reforms that I've described. Reforms to the state-owned utility company, to the Jones Act, and reforms to the way that we spend money through the federal government in Puerto Rico. I hope my colleagues will work with me to find a more responsible, sustainable, meaningful way to help our brothers and sisters in areas affected by the recent hurricanes. Congress has the authority to lead, especially over Puerto Rico, where we have plenary power that exceeds the authority we have in other parts of the country within states. But in this hour of crisis, especially with regard to Puerto Rico, we're the only ones who undisputably have this power. And we are the ones who must act if we're going to achieve meaningful reform. If we can only offer money and a pat on the head, it will be our fault when the American people continue to suffer as a result of failed programs that haven't worked and call out to us through their failures for reform. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.